Hi everyone, this week on Freedom Advocacy Network, we find out what GDP means and what the government should do to improve the South African economy. We have an exciting show ahead, so stay tuned. Hey, so welcome to Freedom Fanatics. This is a production of the Freedom Advocacy Network, and each week we discuss the latest fan content with our authors and our creators right here. My name is Sholan, and this week I'm joined by a first-time guest, David, who is the Chief Operating Officer at the Center for Risk Analysis. And then we also have the usual Alex, who is our Digital Content Coordinator here at FAN. Thank you guys for making the time. And I think we can get straight into it. So first we'll be looking at our latest explainer video, which is titled Fighting for Real Economic Empowerment. What is GDP? Let's have a quick watch.
Whenever politicians or economists talk about the economy, it often sounds like wara wara waffle. To make economic policy something you can use to fight for freedom, let's un-wara wara a key economic term, GDP. GDP, or gross domestic product, is the total sum of money that would be needed to buy every finished product and every available service in a country in 1 year. High GDP growth means an economy is doing well, people and businesses producing lots of products and services. People living in countries with high economies and high GDP growth are healthier, happier, and better educated. In South Africa, high levels of GDP growth were achieved between 1994 and 2007, improving lives across all racial groups. The number of people employed doubled. Access to housing, water, and electricity increased by 200%. During this period, the government did not max out its credit card, falling into debt, and had a relatively free economy, where people had the freedom to trade without too much government interference. The country also benefited from a global commodity boom. People wanted to buy what we were selling. But since the financial crisis of 2007, South Africa's economy has fared poorly. Freedom to trade has suffered due to the government interfering with onerous and expensive laws and regulations. To implement them, government has become bigger, costing the taxpayer more. Higher taxes to pay more government salaries, higher costs for businesses to comply with more complex rules, and of course, more corruption. The first step in fighting for freedom is using knowledge to challenge those in power. The next time a politician promises you a better life, ask them, how will your policies make it easier for ordinary people to trade and make life better by boosting our GDP? Your freedom is worth fighting for. Join FAN today to build a new tomorrow.
So, David, I'll come to you first. Something our explainer video highlights, and I think it's quite evident, is that people living in countries with healthy economies and high GDP growth tend to be healthier, happier, and better educated. And I think we see that pro-free market policies improve lives and boost GDP. And this is evident across the world, in Botswana, in South Korea, in Singapore, and of course in the West. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, Sholan, that explainer video I thought was a really excellent and succinct description of the power of economic growth and why GDP is a number that we obsess about as analysts, but also economists and ordinary people should really be very much focused on that figure. So as the explainer described, GDP measures the aggregate amount of goods and services produced in an economy in any given year. There are a couple of different measures. So there's a nominal GDP, which includes increases in prices. So you may have listened to your grandparents telling you that when they were young, the cost of going to the cinema was about R1 and they could buy a Coke and a box of popcorn. But now if you had to go to the cinema, you'd probably spend about R100. So that is a reflection of inflation and increases in prices. So nominal GDP increases include inflation, so that just measures that increase in prices. But real GDP takes into account inflation and adjusts for inflation. So you'll often see that real GDP is measured according to, for example, 2009 prices. So that adjusts the measure of aggregate growth in the economy and takes into account those price increases as well. And then there's also something called GDP per capita, which takes into account the size of the population. So different countries have different population sizes, and those population sizes fluctuate over time. So GDP per capita measures the wealth of an average citizen of a country. And so you also want to see that going up, because you might have a situation where you have very high inequality and aggregate GDP is going up, but your average person is staying poorer. So you also want the median GDP to go up. But just to your initial question, GDP growth is not some abstraction. It really impacts on people's quality of life, their life opportunities, and their standard of living. So you mentioned South Korea there, and my brother lives in South Korea. And if you go back to immediately after the Civil War ended in the 1950s, 1954, South Korea was actually a very poor country and had the same GDP as Ghana did. And Ghana was about to be, it was in the process of decolonizing. And so those two countries started at the same point, essentially. But today, Korea is one of the wealthiest countries in the world on a GDP per capita basis, but also aggregate GDP. And today, Ghana, whilst it's growing nicely, it's coming from still many decades of wasted opportunities, lost growth. And so there's what economists would call an opportunity cost there, that Ghana is now playing catch up. But the life of your average Korean is a lot better than the life of your average Ghanaian. And so I think that really underscores the importance of growth. And also growth compounds over time. So growth building upon growth creates massive amounts of economic opportunity for people.
Yeah, thanks for that, David. And Alex, I'm coming to you right now. So another thing I'll explain the video actually touches on is that since the financial crisis in 2007, 2008, we have seen that South Africa has been struggling economically. And another event that coincided with this period was the political transition within the ANC, where we saw Thabo Mbeki being removed, and later on Jacob Zuma actually taking a long-term reins of the ANC. And he squad, the RDT faction, I think, it was the moment to shine. Was there a change of policy we saw as well?
I mean, I'm not I think David can probably better speak to the actual policies that were implemented. I mean, I know when I was in school during those glorious early 2000s, we learned about gear. And obviously when you're a kid, you get taught to learn these acronyms. But I think that was a great Kickstarter for South Africa's economy. And since then, it's difficult to say, because the sort of really devastating policies, internal policies of the African National Congress, who obviously run our government, things like cadre deployment were implemented, I think, even under Mandela. Black economic empowerment, which we've spoken about before, that was implemented around 2002, 2003. But those are more internal mechanisms. But what they meant is that when it came to that changeover in leadership of the ANC, they doubled down on those ideas and used policy to really leverage it to their own sort of gain. as we know during Zuma's years. So I think David might be able to speak more to what policies were implemented themselves.
Yeah, David. You might be muted. But yeah, David, just your quick thoughts on the policies. Yeah.
Yeah, so I think the key difference, and Alex is right, some of the harmful policies that we are now burdened with today actually had their origins in the Mbeki era. So we shouldn't be giving the Mbeki administration too much of a free pass. But one thing that they did do exceptionally well is control government spending. And so that's the difference between the revenue that government generates from taxation and the expenditure. So government spends on public services, hospitals, schools, roads, policing. And for many years during the apartheid era, as there were states of emergency and apartheid was kind of essentially collapsing, the government, the National Party government, spent well beyond its means. And during the transition, there was a lot of very high government spending. And there was a period for a couple of years, 1994, 1995, where the government was trying to increase spending in a kind of redistributionist way. And Thabo Mbeki and his gang, Trevor Manuel and others, Trevor Manuel became the finance minister, they set about to curtail government spending and to reduce that deficit, the difference between revenue and expenditure. And they actually succeeded in not only reducing that deficit, but actually creating a fiscal surplus, which was unheard of at the time for an emerging market. So they collected more money than they actually spent. So that enabled the government actually to spend more on other social services. So in a bizarre way, being more prudent enabled them to spend more. But why were they able to collect more revenues? Well, because they implemented policies that encourage businesses to invest, to create new jobs, and a lot of those dividends came from the mining sector. There was a global commodities super cycle. There were a lot of opportunities for foreign investors to come in. It was a kind of a good story for South Africa to tell. It was the build up to the World Cup, but all of this came crashing down in 2007, 2008 with two events, the global financial crisis, as well as the election of Jacob Zuma to become president of the ANC. And unfortunately, that introduced a new era of government excess, corruption, and really a big bloated administration that had a lot of very harmful policies, but also very confusing policies for investors. And so what we saw during the 2010s was a kind of a gradual decline, like a slow puncture. And today we are stuck with very, very low rates of economic growth, very high government spending, and governments also borrowing increasingly much more money in order to finance its activities. So there's a ratio called the debt to GDP ratio, which is the percentage of debt as an expression of overall GDP. And in that period, in the mid-2000s, as I think your explainer video showed, there was high growth. So we were able to get debt down to about 26%. Today, it's now rocketed up to about 80%. And so that means that government is increasingly spending more and more of its budget just on paying back the principal and the interest on debt. So that means that essentially we're spending about as much money on paying back debt every year as we are on our entire healthcare budget. So just think of what you could do with that money. And luckily we still have lenders internationally who are willing to lend us money, but we're essentially operating on borrowed time there, and we need to bring that debt to GDP ratio down again.
Yeah, as always, David, your insights are incredible. Alex, I actually also want to relate something that David was speaking on, which was the South Africa's debt, and an article that we actually published on FAN which is titled Politicians Should Strive for Less and Not More Government, actually highlights an important point that and gives us a solution to this problem, is that for us to solve and tackle overall wasteful spending and loss of money due to corruption, there's actually a proposal by the South African Institute of Race Relations, which actually is titled the Non-Racial Economic Empowerment for the Disadvantaged. And this essentially attempts to direct the funds for housing, education, and healthcare into vouchers that are given directly to ordinary South Africans. If you don't mind for just a minute speaking towards that.
Yeah, for sure. So I think what's important here is that, so linking back to what I mentioned earlier about the sort of the deployment networks and BE, these are the mechanisms that the government uses to enrich themselves. And so what the need policy does is essentially takes away that mechanism for that middleman transaction. You can't have some cadre who's going to help you facilitate PPE equipment between users and the government or suppliers. And so for example, as a healthcare voucher, what you would do is ordinary citizens would get a voucher, and they then can decide how they want to spend it, whether they want to go to a state hospital, to a private hospital. It's up to them. If they want to go to a pharmacy to get drugs that they need to assist them with their health, so be it. But it gives the power back to people, and that is the ultimate goal, to help people solve the problems that they have without that money being wasted. And there's a lot of that goes to waste in South Africa. And just one last point to add is, in terms of size of government, is we saw Zuma's, the one thing that did change when Zuma came to power was we saw the massive inflation of the size of the cabinet. And so there were way more government employees to pay. And as we mentioned in the explainer video, more salaries to pay, which means more taxpayer money is going towards people who aren't necessarily adding value to the country or serving South Africans, regrettably, unfortunately. So, yeah.
Thanks for that. Guys, thank you for your thoughts on our explainer video and our article. And to our viewers, you can find all our written content on our website, freedomadvocacy.net. And we have now reached the end of this episode. So don't forget to catch us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, and IGTV. Wherever you are on social media, that's where we are. And to join, fan, and support our fight for freedom, you can sign up at freedomadvocacy.net. So remember, guys, that your freedom is worth fighting for.